So I now was trapped in this corner, standing just a yard from him, and he's looking at me, and I'm looking at him, and I'm thinking, I don't want to be here. And so I had to wait for the interview to finish before I could sort of slink out. But yeah, there have been times, I must admit, where, they can get awkward.
Football Drop Podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Football Drop. We've got a special this week. It's taken a little while to get this one organised. We've had a few technical hitches, shall we say. But this one I'm personally very excited about. We have managed to get one of the original reporters for Sky Sports News on the show. One that I actually remember quite fondly as one of the first reporters' names that I remembered whilst watching football. I'm delighted to introduce Guy Havord to the show. How are you?
I'm very well. You make me sound like a member of the Rolling Stones. I'm not that old.
We'll set you up on a pedestal as high as we can, and then we can just...
Yeah, I'm not comparing myself to Mick Jagger, but age-wise, it's... I go a long way back. Let's put it that way.
No, honestly, thank you for coming on the show, Guy. How's everything?
It's really good. Had a good weekend. I was at Everton on Saturday, which was fantastic.
What
and particularly... Yeah, it was. I mean... Not what you want as a commentator, a goal in 10 seconds. Tell you what, that's probably the worst feeling in the world. You're sort of reading your carefully crafted couple of sentences. You look up and you go, oh my God, there's going to be a goal here. And lo and behold, there was. But no, it's a great afternoon. I've got such affection for Goodison Park, and it's probably the last time I'll ever go there.
Okay.
I worked at the local radio station many, many years ago. I used to present there every other Saturday, one at Anfield, one at Goodison. So it felt like a sort of a farewell for me. I don't think I'll probably go again for the rest of the season. So it was lovely to be there.
What was the atmosphere like? Because obviously now Moisey's taken over again. They seem to be on an incredible run of form. It's 3 from 4?
It's 3 on the bounce. In fact, that was my opening line. The last time that happened was April ago. So it was April last year that they last won 3 on the bounce. And that was the week they got out of relegation trouble completely mathematically. But yeah, I mean, it was... Wow. I mean, I've watched it from afar, obviously. I did the game at Southampton's only win of the season, prior to the weekend, ironically, where Everton were pretty... So you've watched it from afar and thought, crikey, it's not been good. But yeah, it was lovely. I mean, to score a goal in 10 seconds and then another one in, 5 minutes, it's sort of a relaxing afternoon. All the songs were coming out. They were singing songs of David Moyes. I got the bus back, actually, from Goodison, because it's so hard to get back to Lime Street. And I had to queue up for about 40 minutes. I got on this bus with a load of guys who'd obviously had a few drinks, and they started singing a song from the 1985 team. So they went through the whole team, wow. Sheedy, Stevens, Southall. I'd never heard it before, but it was like, but they were obviously of that generation, of that vintage. And I thought, crikey, it's lovely that, I remember that 85 team, which was just so exciting to watch. And they came from nowhere, didn't they, and won the league. And sadly, my wife is an Evertonian, and I married into a family of Evertonians. So it's been a lot of gloom and doom for the last few decades. So obviously they're not going to win anything, with that win. But just the sense of, we can leave Goodison without too much stress, hopefully. But you never know with the Blues, though, do you?
No, I think I've been pretty critical of them over the last couple of seasons because they just haven't been good enough. They've been really scrapping around the bottom, and they are a big club and they should be higher. I think the recruitment's not been great, and they've had a few issues kind of off the pitch, lots of uncertainty, which I fully appreciate. But I think, this season was all about just cement Premier League status, wasn't it? Moving to the new ground.
Exactly. And new ground, new owners. It's an exciting summer ahead, isn't it?
Absolutely. What's your other half think about the whole Dyche sacking and Moyes coming back? Just quite curious from an Everton fan perspective.
I think everybody was disappointed to see him go. I think there's a lot of affection for him. I think he did a good job in really difficult circumstances. And David Moyes been fantastic in terms of, I have to ask him post-match, what's the difference? What's changed? And you've got to be careful as a manager, haven't you? Because if you say, well, the players are more confident, the players are enjoying themselves, you're naturally criticising the predecessors. He was sort of going out of his way to sort of not say that. And he sort of paid tribute to Sean Dyche. I think whatever the manager has been of Everton in the last few years, it's been really, really difficult. And it does feel like a wonderful line in the sand, doesn't it? If they can get to the new stadium, new owners, new era, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's talk all about you then. Obviously, this episode is all about yourself and your sort of career to date. How did you kind of first get into the sort of football side, and especially the sort of commentary and reporting?
Well, sort of from day one, it was about the only thing I ever wanted to do. I was football mad, I was sports mad as a kid. And it really was as simple as I need to find a job where they will pay me to watch sport. I thought that about, I don't know, 8 or 9.
Amazing.
I thought, right, what is the job where they will pay you money, you can do it all your life, and then they send you to watch football matches? And so it had to be journalism. Well, obviously I wanted, first division football as it was then, and I realised I wasn't good enough. So yeah, it was as simple as that. And I just sort of started when I was still at college, I think I was. I did some work for the local radio station there. Used to go out and do interviews with managers. I had that sort of naivety that you have when you're really young. I just wrote to sort of famous people and said, can I interview you? And one or two of them said yes. So I got some really nice interviews. The first ever interview I did was with a cricket player who I was really admired. He played for Surrey. His name was Roger Knight. Okay. And this was the time when there wasn't a lot of money in cricket. And so if you were a county player, you only got a contract for 6 months of the year. And for the rest of the year, you had to find a job. So most of the cricketers would get a job working in sales or insurance or in a shop or selling Christmas trees. Roger Knight, who came, I think he went for Oxford or Cambridge. He, during the winter, was a headmaster at a public school. That was his part-time job. So he played cricket during the summer. And during the winter, he was headmaster of Cranley School. So I got in contact with him and he said, yeah, why don't you come and do an interview? I was so nervous. I was about, 16, 17, had a massive tape recorder, bigger than a room. I sat down and he obviously sensed that I was nervous, but being a sort of a teacher, a headmaster, he tried to put me at my ease and he said, would you like a drink? I said, yes, could I have a Coca-Cola? He said, what about a sherry? So he gave me a sherry. It's the only time I've drunk alcohol during an interview. So I was sipping a sherry while I was doing that. So yeah, that was probably my first ever interview. And then I did local radio. County Sound was our local radio station near Guildford. And the glamour team there were Aldershot. That was as good as it got, our catchment area. So we had Aldershot, Farnborough, Woking, Dorking. Godalming Town was the first game I ever did. And I had to go to a call box and phone in my report and put my 10Ps and do the report live. Again, Can't tell you how nervous I was. And from there, what did I do next? I got a job at the Sun, part-time job at the Sun. So I interviewed Pat Edery, who was a famous jockey. I rang up the Sun. Again, all these sort of naive things you do when you're young. I said, hello, I've got an interview with Pat Edery. Would you be interested? And they said, well, not really. We've got a racing correspondent who goes drinking with Pat Edery every night. But they were nice enough. So they said, why don't you come in, have a look around? And I got a little bit of work there on the racing desk. But I sort of knew I didn't want to do writing journalism. I wanted to do radio because I'd sort of fallen in love with that, listening to football on the radio, the likes of sort of Brian Butler and Peter Jones. So that was the path in. And so from there, I went to LBC, I worked for BT, and then I worked at Radio City in Liverpool. That was my first probably proper job where we covered Everton and Liverpool. And from there, I went to Radio Lancashire and then to Sky, sort of mid-90s, I think it was. So, yeah, there's a sort of potted history of my life.
Amazing. What, out of your sort of roles to date then, what one do you think you've sort of learnt the most, Sky aside, obviously, because I appreciate you've been there for quite a while, but what sort of specific role do you think really just kind of encompassed everything and just said, this is 100% what I want. I've learnt so much. This is it.
I think it's probably local radio, which was massive when I was younger. As I said, there was no Sky, there was no satellite television, there was no internet. So the way you sourced, particularly football, was through radio, local radio. So Saturday afternoon, you'd hear radios, you'd walk around and they'd all be having, the football, particularly in Liverpool, all the stores down the high street would have Radio City on. No one listened to Radio Merseyside while we were there. But yeah, it was something magical about radio. I still love it and I do a bit from time to time. But because there wasn't a lot of money in local radio, you had to do everything. So I started actually doing the local sport, the bulletins in the morning and the breakfast show. So I get up at 4 a.m. in Liverpool, walk through the city centre, or some people were still going home to bed, and then present the bulletins in the morning. And then I'd sometimes do games midweek. And then on a Saturday, initially, I used to present the programme from Anfield one week and then Goodison the next. And then I'd have a commentator alongside me. So it'd be either Graham Beecroft or Kevin Keatings, who are still, working really hard, two terrific colleagues. And yeah, because football kicks off at 3:00. Everything kicked off at 3:00 back in the day. Everything kicked off on a Saturday afternoon. It's extraordinary to think now there was no Sunday football, there was no Monday night football. And then while I was at Radio City, Sky came along and started to change things. And Liverpool games generally were often moved for a Sunday game or a Monday game, which obviously changed the dynamic of radio. And then over the decades, Sky's become bigger, BBC, ITV, even the newspapers, the internet now. There's so many different ways, aren't there, to access your sports information, that local radio still survives. In fact, I was at Goodison, as I said, on Saturday, and I saw Ian Kennedy, who is still working for Radio Merseyside and was there when I was there sort of 30 years ago. So certain cities have really stuck, and the BBC have done a brilliant job. I work for an independent station, Radio City, and I don't think they do as much, certainly, as we did back in the day. So BBC, I know they get a lot of flack, but wow, they are keeping grassroots going in terms of sport. And if they were to depart, there'd be a lot of people, because it's not just Liverpool and Everton, it's Tranmere Rovers. And when I worked at Radio Lancashire, it's Preston are doing well now and Burnley are doing well now. But when I was there, Burnley were a fourth tier team, and so were Preston. So they didn't get a lot of national coverage at all, but we would commentate on them, do loads of interviews with them. So I think that link with the community that the BBC do is absolutely priceless.
Yeah, I think it probably kind of brings us on quite nicely to kind of the impact of Sky as well. Now, obviously, I appreciate you work for them, so we're not going to obviously necessarily speak badly about them. But obviously, Sky, as you said, kind of transformed football pretty much, all the different schedules. Obviously, the Champions League have come in, and I know TNT have got it at the moment, so they sort of dictate these different kickoffs and things like that. But do you think it's got better because there's more football on, or is that probably not so much of a good thing these days because you've got it? I mean, realistically, you've probably got football on every day now, haven't you? Whether it's European or domestic football live on some sort of TV channel.
Oh, yeah, totally. I mean, I think I counted the other day, there was something like 22 matches over the course of a weekend that you could access, obviously with subscriptions, not just Sky, but, we got European football being covered. Yeah, I don't think anyone could argue that football is not in a better place than it was, certainly when I was growing up. I remember the era of hooliganism, where gates were down to, I see your shirts in the background, you support a fairly decent team. I remember when Arsenal used to get less than 20,000 or early 20,000s for games. And these were matches that you could turn up on the day. They weren't all ticket. So that period during the 80s and the early 90s, football was in a really bad place. People didn't want to go to football. It was dangerous. I think football fans were seen as yobbos, idiots. They were sort of looked down upon. The stadiums were, they were so bad. Some of the stadiums, I mean, really unsafe, appealing places to go to. But when you're a youngster, it was quite it's very tribal to stand on a terrace and and then suddenly you had Tottenham fans running at you. It was scary, but as a young bloke, I hate to say it, but it was quite exciting. But once you get to a certain age and other people are not going to appeal. So it was, sadly, there were several things that happened, I think, that transformed football. Sky was definitely one of them. And the other two things were the Hillsborough tragedy, which made football and the government have a look at the game at long last. They sort of ignored it and people said, right, sorry, enough is enough. Things have to change. And along came the Taylor report and, of course, all-seater stadiums. But it wasn't just the seats, I think, that changed. It was the fact that we were now building proper stadiums, healthy stadiums, safe stadiums, appealing stadiums. And then you had Italia 90, where suddenly football became sexy again. Gaza came along and wooed a nation. England nearly won the World Cup. And it then became overnight. And I sort of resented it a bit at the time. It suddenly became really hip and trendy. Everybody was interested in football, and you thought, well, where were you 5 years ago when, I was standing on a terrace with 12 other people? The Fast Show do a brilliant skit of that, don't they, where they sort of take the mickey out of he is an Arsenal fan. I think he turns up at an Arsenal game, but with a food hamper. He's a Johnny come lately, and he offers some marmalade and stuff to people who are watching. So it changed, not in a blink of an eye, but obviously Sky came along, offered a huge amount of money. I say a huge amount of money. It's £300 million for 5 years, which at the time was a lot of money, but now probably wouldn't, buy you a handful of games, wouldn't it?
So clubs these days.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very much so. Well, it's a transfer window today, isn't it? So we'll probably see that spent and a little bit more. Yeah. So then suddenly, there was money to spend. The stadiums were done really well. They were done properly. And you suddenly got Zola coming along. You suddenly got, what else do we have? Well, the man behind you, my idol, arguably, Dennis Bergkamp. I can't tell you when we signed, I'm neutral, obviously, but I might have a leaning to one team. But when Arsenal signed Dennis Bergkamp, to me, it was surreal. I've been so used to all these English players, the odd Scot, the odd Irishman, and suddenly you had this exotic player from Holland who you'd seen on the television, who was just, what's Mourinho expression, not out of the bottle. He was just completely different. And I saw his debut against Middlesbrough, I think, on the opening day, and I just kept looking at it. That's Dennis Bergkamp. He's got an Arsenal top on. He's playing for Arsenal. So all this happened. We had Juninho, the top players in Brazil at the time, suddenly arrived at Middlesbrough, and you're going, Juninho's playing for Middlesbrough. Ravanelli's playing for Middlesbrough. Ginola turns up at Newcastle. All these wonderful players overnight. So in the space of 3, 4, 5 years, it just transformed, and as a result, the media transformed as well. So Sky came along at the perfect time and helped kickstart sort of this football revolution. But then you had newspapers that maybe only would do 2 or 3 pages on football, were suddenly doing pullouts on a Saturday, pullouts on a Sunday. There was a brief period, I think, where we had sports newspapers as well, just devoted to sport. They didn't quite work, but sort of maybe just preceded the internet, which came along in the 90s, which then was able to give all this information online, and it became more and more niche. Something else I should say, actually, I did a fanzine of a aforementioned club, and that was sort of the fact that there was such a dearth of information about the team that you supported. So the team that I supported, who were in North London and playing red and white, there was nothing that you could find out about them apart from programmes. And the programmes, as you know, even now are like from Moscow, aren't they? Everything's great. We've lost 5 on the trot, but don't worry about it. Everything's, there was nothing there. So we did a fanzine, and that went down really well. And now you see so many websites that are devoted, and podcasts devoted to just one team. And I mean, literally, I think I'm doing Port Vale commentary in a couple of weeks' time. And I did Bristol Rovers a couple of weeks back. And I think like 4 or 5 podcasts I can just download, have a listen to, and then I immediately know what's going on, who are the players who are in and who are the players who are out. So it's fantastic as a commentator, the amount of information. Because when I started, we basically, do you know the Rothmans yearbook?
Don't know.
No, wow. This is like talking to your granddad. I don't know what it's called. It was called Rothmans because obviously it's sponsored by Rothmans. It's this fabulous book. You know Wisdom, don't you? The Wisdom Cricket Almanac. You bluffing now, aren't you? You don't.
I was,
you just said, I could tell. I've lost you. Anyway, for the oldies amongst us. So the Rothmans Football Yearbook basically was a yearbook that came out at the start of the season, and it had a page on each team. It had the results from last season. It had the squad, and it had their heights and their weights, how many games they played last season, how many goals they scored. And that was about it. That's all you had for the whole season in terms of information. So when you did your prep,
now.
Yeah. I think Sky sponsored it for a time. I'm not sure they do it anymore because, again, this was pre-internet. You don't need it now because all the stats are being updated. I was going to say on a daily basis.
Live, isn't it? Yeah.
It's a minute. Yeah. Well, the game at Goodison I did Saturday, the goal goes in. You're immediately going, okay, where does that sit in goals in history? And
within Sky are quite good with it, aren't they? Like when you're doing the Soccer Saturday show and things like that, they're literally updating the table as it stands. Do you think? How are you updating it so quickly? It's all just within a blink of an eye, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And on the apps now, you can look at it and it's all updated. So, yeah. I mean, I forgot what your original question was, but I think radio was where I had to learn everything, learn how to interview, learn how to edit, learn how to present, learn how to commentate, learn how to book press passes, learn how to deal with equipment that didn't work when you got to the ground and you were on your own and you plugged it in and, we couldn't get it. I was in Moscow once doing a game. Blackburn Rovers were playing Spartak Moscow in the Champions League.
Wow.
And I had such a nightmare. I don't think I got on air like in the second half on a phone. I had to borrow someone's phone because our link didn't work. But there was a famous incident where David Batty had a fight with one of his teammates, and I've forgotten who the other player is now. Who was it now? Was it Wilcox or Ripley? Anyway, it'll come back to me later. You research it. David Batty had a bit of a dust. Graham Lasso, that's it. So Batty and Lasso had a dust up during the game, right? Big incident. I missed it because I was under the table pulling wires in and out to try and get myself connected to Radio Lancashire. I missed it, and it was only like 2 days later. I was reading the newspaper, and I was, what dust up? I didn't see a dust up, and then I saw it. So yeah, whenever I think of Moscow, my heart sinks. I think, oh God, that was the night. And they pulled all the programming on the radio station because we kicked off. Obviously, the time difference. I think we kicked off 5 o'clock in English time. So the station had pulled their news program. Go right, we're going to go straight to Moscow and Guy Havord, blah blah blah. And I wasn't there. So Paul Mariner, the former England striker who used to work for us as a co-commentator, he was in the studio. He was having to commentate off the television with the presenter. So it's strange, isn't it? That was such a long time ago. But even now, I'm sort of coming out in the cold sweat.
It's nice to, I know it sounds terrible, but it's nice to know that it's not all glitz and glam.
Very little
from my side. I see you guys, you kind of see it on the news.
That's you know what that is? That's the Rothman's yearbook arriving.
This is the joy of technology these days.
That's how good Amazon is. Just delivered it and it's there.
We're not affiliated with Amazon, guys. But no, when you sort of see it on the news, see it on the shows on a Saturday and things, you see, you get to watch the football. As you said, that's the biggest driving factor behind, why yourself got into it. And, from my side, I just think that's fantastic to go and watch two random teams I might not know anything about, Port Vale against whoever, for example. And you think this is fantastic. And, I appreciate you get some notes and you get some info books and stuff beforehand. But it's not all glitz and glam. You may have technical issues. You think, oh my God, what the hell am I doing? I need to do this, you need to do that. Is it, I'm assuming it's a little bit more updated these days. It's a little bit easier to get the kit set up, ready to go.
Yeah, I think it depends what you're doing. I mean, luckily, so I'm freelancing now, so a lot of the work, I do a lot of work for Sky, but I do work for other companies as well. And it's mainly sort of TV commentary. So you're lucky enough, you've got producers, you've got engineers, sound engineers, you've got an OB. So the game at Goodison Saturday would Sky, in fact, it was a BBC OB. So those are easy because if there's a problem, you just sort of hand it over and someone else will sort it out for you. But back in the day of local radio especially, you were just a one-man band, and so you had to sort it out. And that could be really, really difficult. And it's just the frustration of not really knowing what you're doing. I mean, you saw how long it took me to sort of get onto this link in the first place. You can imagine me trying to set up a commentary from Moscow or even Deepdale, you know what I mean? It depends, but I think technology's got a lot better now. And obviously it's so much easier, isn't it, to connect. The worst comes to the worst, you've got a mobile phone. Again, back in the day, I had a mobile phone and I'd be sent out to sort of non-league games when I started. And I'd take 4 batteries with me that were probably about that size. Those of you watching, those of you who are not watching, what's that? The size of a brick.
Pretty big,
it's
guys.
A brick. Yeah. The size, so you take about 3 or 4 bricks with you and you get, you get 5 minutes out of them each. So you'd be, having to be quite short and sharp with your reports. Yeah, things have changed for the better, undoubtedly, technology-wise.
Amazing. So I just want to talk a little bit more about a bit of insight, if you can. Just what's actually involved when you're doing the reporting and the commentary side. I suppose commentary probably more interestingly because when you listen to matches, the commentators know every single player. You know how to say all of their names, and obviously the beauty of football now is we've got people from all over the world. So the names can be very difficult for people who don't necessarily speak fluent Russian or whatever language it may be. So what's involved with all of that, and how much prep do you get, and how much assistance do you get?
A lot of prep, an unbelievable amount of prep, and it is a little bit like you can't have enough time, you can't have too much time to prep, and you generally end up prepping all the time you've got, or I do anyway. So if I just take this weekend, so I did Everton on Saturday, which was on site, and then I did an Eredivisie game, which was at Stockley Park, which is only half an hour from here, which was Willem II against, so I'm going to sound very pretentious now because I do it in the Dutch pronunciation, RZ. It's AZ Alkmaar, but we have to call them RZ. So two different types of game. The Everton game, in a way, is slightly easier because you know most of the players. You've seen them so often. They are, internationals, they are regulars. But you still got to prep for the 11 players that will start. There'll be 9 subs. So you're prepping 20 players per side immediately. And then there's going to be 3 or 4 who are doubts with injury. So Calvert-Lewin at the start of the week, Mangala, weren't actually ruled out, although I think everybody suspected they would be. And then you had James Garner and Tim Irabunum, who were back after injury. So would they be back in the squad again? So you had to prep for them. So sometimes you can prep for about 50 players for one game. And you have to, as you said, get their pronunciation right. You have to remember their number. You have to remember their face. I know that sounds stupid, but if they score a goal and someone runs towards you and it's the camera's looking down their face, you've got to name it. If it's come from a corner and there's a flurry of bodies and you're not quite sure, you look at the camera, what's the close-up? You need to know and call it straight away. Okay. And then you also need to know a wide shot of him. So what colour boots has he got on? What's his haircut? Does he wear short or long sleeve shirts? Right. Black boots are brilliant. There's 1 or 2 players who wear black boots, but we've gone through this phase of everyone seems to wear white boots, which is a nightmare for a commentator. You want black boots, orange boots, great, just so you can differentiate, because you will always get, players who look slightly similar, and you don't want to call one in case it's the other. So if one's got a different shade of boots, or one's got short sleeves, or as happens at the moment, one has got gloves on, it's fantastic. Great, I can differentiate. And then you can go with your commentary really confidently. Otherwise, you're sort of, who is it? And you have to keep waffling.
Do you write your notes beforehand? So when you're actually at the game, obviously watch them walk out, and because I know sometimes the players will change their boots and they won't always wear a glove and things. So do you take notes of that as they're walking out and stuff as well?
I do it when I watch the games. So I'll watch games during the week.
Right, okay.
Most recent matches that they've played. And then, if they've got black boots on or if they wear short sleeves, that's not always the case, but generally they tend to continue with that for most of the season. He's got a beard or he's lost his beard or whatever, just sort of little things to help you. And then, of course, that's just the basics. That's the identification. And then you've got to come up with something that's interesting. You've got to, how long has James Garner been out for? Why did he get injured? When did he get injured? Just remind fans he started the season. What's his background? He started at Man United. He went on loan here and there. So you've got to be clear in your head that you sort of know a little potted history of them. He might not play, but equally he was sensational. He came in, played centre midfield and created certainly 1 goal for Beto and just looked really good. So suddenly I was with Leon as co-commentator. So we're talking about James Garner a lot. So you need a bit of background. Well, this is only his, whatever it was, 4th, 5th start of the season. So, but it might be that he didn't play. So that's why you have to prep for 20, 25 players in case one of them comes in or comes off the bench in the 80th minute and scores a worldie. You've got to know a little bit about him. So that was Everton, which I said is slightly easier because there's more information out there. The game on Sunday was probably harder because it's off tube, so you're just commentating on a television. You haven't got a co-commentator, so you've got to fill all the time, all the replays, all the analysis yourself. And you're dealing with players that you're not familiar with. And the pronunciations, obviously a lot of Dutch pronunciations, and you have to learn the way that they pronounce certain words. You then have to, again, do the potted history, the close-up, the wide shot. Can you recognise them? And then to add to that, a Willem Tway had shirts with so many stripes on and the numbers were so blurred that you could barely see the numbers anyway. So that sends a fear of God into you. So you then spend more time watching them. So even now, even more than ever, you need to work out which is the one with the black boots, who's got the long hair, who's got the short hair, who's got... And so you can identify them almost without numbers off the television.
Wow.
Yeah, a lot of prep. And it is a phenomenal amount of prep. And every time I speak to someone, you know, a mate or whatever, and sometimes I've got all my prep on my phone and I just dig my sheet out and show them and they go, wow. So that's what you do all day.
So yeah, I suppose if anyone who's listening or watching, if you're thinking about getting into it, there's a lot of work to do. It's not all just, I'll get to watch football and just talk about it like what we do on the podcast. There's a hell of a lot more involved.
Yeah, there's different types of jobs. Obviously, when I was reporting, it's slightly easier in terms of the prep, because if you're doing an interview with a manager pre-match or post-match, you don't need that depth of knowledge. You don't really need the numbers of the players, or, you know, if James Garner does come in from nowhere, all you need to know is that James Garner has been injured. He last played in October. And then as the game develops, if he's suddenly playing really well, you're sat pitch side, you can just go on your phone and then you can do your little potted history of James Garner, because you know you're going to be interviewing him or Beto, who scored 2, didn't he, at the weekend. So you know who's going to be the man of the match. And in terms of the managers, you go to the match needing to know the big stuff, the big picture stuff. So Everton on the brink of 3 successive Premier League wins. David Moyes' 4th game in charge, I think it was. They were 3-0 up against Tottenham. They were 3-0 up on Saturday as well. It's bigger picture stuff, so you need less prep. And a lot of the post-match, you're generally reacting to what's happened in the game anyway. So you don't need a lot of stuff that you've done, apart from, you know, it's 3 wins on the trot now. That hasn't happened since last year or whatever. But we're talking about the game. We're talking about the transformation. So I think as a reporter, in terms of a pitch side reporter, touchline reporter, there's less prep needed for that.
Okay. And in terms of your sort of reporting career then, has there been anyone who's been really difficult to talk to and do a sort of post-match interview? Or any that you can disclose, I should say, because there was a big smirk on your face there.
Yeah. Oh, God. What? Have I come across an angry football manager after a heavy defeat? Yes, I think so. Oh, yeah, plenty.
Who's been the worst for you, or who stands out for you?
I don't want to name names because some of them are still managing in the Premier League, and I might be interviewing them in the weeks ahead after a match. But I mean, what I can say is that I've had a few managers who've walked out on interviews that I've done. So Harry Redknapp walked out on an interview that I did. David O'Leary walked out on an interview, and Arsene Wenger sort of walked out on an interview when Arsenal lost at Bradford in the League Cup.
Wow.
And I'd asked 1 or 2 questions that he didn't like, and he just he terminated the interview. So that was awkward, but I think...
Understatement.
Well, shall I tell you why it was really awkward? Because it was at Bradford, and their media facilities weren't great at the time, and we were actually in the laundry room. So it was set up in the laundry rooms.
Okay.
I did the interview. It sort of ended really awkwardly, and I thought, I just want to get out of here. So I moved away as quickly as I could for what I thought was the door, and then I realised the door was locked, and the only way back out of the laundry room was to walk backwards past Arsene Wenger. But he'd already started another interview with a BBC reporter. I think it was Alistair Yeomans. So they started the interview. So I now was trapped in this corner, standing just a yard from him, and he's looking at me and I'm looking at him and I'm thinking, I don't want to be here. And so I had to wait for the interview to finish before I could sort of slink out. But yeah, there have been times, I must admit, where, yeah, they can get awkward. They can get awkward because you have to ask difficult questions sometimes. I mean, Arsenal just been knocked out by a 4th-tier team, Bradford City. I keep saying 4th-tier team. I think they were still called League Two back in that day.
Right.
So, yeah, you have to ask difficult questions. And sometimes, I don't think you see it quite as much now. I think back in the day, managers had more clout with the media in that they could walk out and they could not turn up for interviews sometimes. And in fact, after the Arsene Wenger interview, I think he didn't speak to Sky for a few weeks. Basically, that was what would happen. If you had an interview that didn't go well, and it happened with Alex Ferguson one or two times, where he would have a fallout with he might have a disagreement with a media company, and then he just said, right, well, I won't be doing post-match interviews. And there was that long gap, wasn't there, with the BBC, where he didn't do any interviews for the BBC.
Yeah, didn't the club ban the Sun, I think, as well at some stage? I can't remember what club it was. Someone banned the Sun.
Well, it might have been Liverpool, mightn't it, after the Hillsborough disaster,
possibly. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, so you had all those bans. I mean, Fergie was notorious, wasn't he, for banning journalists that had written things that he didn't like, So I think you see less of that now for several reasons. One of the main one is that the Premier League have implemented rules where managers now have to turn up for pre-match, have to turn up for post-match. Back in the day, I can remember when Sky started, it was almost like a favour they did to you by turning up, certainly pre-match. It was very rare to do a pre-match interview down the tunnel. That's something that took quite some time to actually be implemented. And then post-match, most of the time they would come out, but sometimes they just wouldn't come out. They'd refuse to come out. Or what they would do is they'd sit in the dressing room watching Sky Sports. And then when Sky Sports went to the end credits and this programme had finished, they'd suddenly come out and do the interview.
No.
It was usually the losing manager. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, I was going to say, shock there. Absolute shock. Wow. God, that must have been so difficult meeting Wenger as well.
Yeah, because
having that.
Yeah, and every interview prior to that had been really smooth, and he was such an easy guy to interview. He was always really polite. He was never, aggressive or anything. You felt you could ask him any question, but maybe I just pushed one or two buttons more than I should have done. But I just felt Arsenal going through that period where they hadn't won a trophy under him for quite some time. And it was seen that the League Cup was almost like the open goal, and they've drawn Bradford City and they've still gone out on penalties. So, he's not angry with me. He's angry with his team and the situation.
Of course. Sorry, just on that, it's not what I've written down. I was just thinking about it. So when you're obviously you're a regular at some of the clubs and you're doing interviews with some of the managers pretty frequently, do you build up a good rapport with them? Because I see sometimes some of the reporters, they'll sort of have a laugh and a joke with some of the managers and things. Is that easy to build, and do you have that with some of the managers now?
Some sort of rapport. Ironically, David Moyes on Saturday, I hadn't seen him for a long time, and we go back a really long way because when I was at Radio Lancashire, he was the centre half, Preston North End, and he said, he might be player coach at the time, I think Gary Peters was the manager, and he said, I want to learn about the media. He said, I want to understand the media. Obviously, he was thinking about being a manager. I didn't know that at the time. So he used to come into the studio at Radio Lancashire in Blackburn, and we'd interview him and we'd have sort of round table discussions. And he was obviously really forward thinking then. And then I think while I was still there, he certainly became player coach, and then he became manager of Preston. And I couldn't have imagined at the time that he would then become, 701 games now in the Premier League. And second only to Wenger and Ferguson. And I tell you what, while I was at Preston and David Moyes was centre half, the youth team manager at the time, who was not happy being youth team manager and was thinking of quitting the job because he was having to go all over the country and wondering whether he would ever get an opportunity to be a manager, was Sam Allardyce, who just a few months later would get the job at Blackpool and then obviously would have his fantastic career. So we had David Moyes and Sam Allardyce at Preston North End, who were in the 4th division at the time. One was a centre-half and the other was the youth? He was a scout or the youth team coach or something like that. Obviously been a terrific player, but he was looking for a way in. And they would be two managers who, they had well over 1,000 games, wouldn't they, in the Premier League alone?
Wow. Christ, I think it's amazing just how much full circle things can go.
Well, sorry, talking of Preston here. Yeah. This is a better name drop. Who was it?
Should be writing all these down.
No, it's just come back to me because I spoke about the laundry room, didn't I, at Bradford City? Well, there was a laundry room at Deepdale as well where we used to do the interviews, the pre-match interviews, and interviews on a Thursday. So we got up on a Thursday or Friday for 4-hour program that we had on a Friday night with dear old Leighton James, the Leighton James Football Hour, which was absolutely fantastic. Leighton was, sorry, I'm going off on a tangent here, but briefly,
No, feel
Leighton,
free.
he just shot from the hip. So he would criticise anybody. But it was fine because he was in the studio every Friday night. We were the ones who then, the following day, had to go to the ground, and the manager would come up to, what Leighton James saying about this? What was Leighton James saying? No, it's not us, it's Leighton James.
Pass it to him.
Yeah, exactly. But he didn't care. But it made for great radio. So yeah, so one, I don't know, Thursday morning, get a call. We've signed a loan player from Manchester United, and he's available for interview. I said, we're a bit busy today. What's his name? And they said, hang on. He said, David Beckham. I said, I've never heard of him. Yeah. They said, all right, I'll come down. And I went and interviewed David Beckham in the laundry room at Deepdale.
Amazing.
So he was there for a month, was fantastic by all accounts, and went back to Manchester United, and the rest is history. So I think maybe in one moment in time, you might have had David Moyes, Sam Allardyce, and David Beckham in the same building. I might be wrong about that, but certainly you could throw a blanket over that time period.
Honestly, that's just incredible. What was David like as a youth player then, pretty much, wasn't he?
Yeah, do you know what? We ended up speaking. The only thing I remember of the interview is he spoke about going to a Tottenham trial, I think with a Man United top on or something like that. But he spoke about how he loved Man United, and he wore a Man United or to a Bobby Charlton football day or something like that. And it was all Tottenham and Arsenal from that sort of, it would be Tottenham, wouldn't it? He was sort of Essex way, wasn't he? Mm. He turned up in a Man United top, and it didn't go down too well, apparently. That's all I remember, to be honest. I mean, now, obviously, we didn't even keep it. We just sort of recorded it. It went out on air, and you wouldn't think that for keeping it.
Yeah, of course. And then years later.
Yeah. And of course, and the other interview that has been kept was the first interview with Ronaldo that Ronaldo did in English in the Premier League. And that's on YouTube. And I did that one as well. And thankfully that has been kept. Gary Neville, it's really strange seeing Gary Neville as a player. But even then you could see he helped Ronaldo get through the interview because he was struggling, obviously, with his English.
That's right, yes.
And we couldn't really get past how happy are you? And then I asked him another question. He didn't have a clue. And Gary Neville was brilliant. He came in and eased the awkwardness and just basically took charge of it and cracked a couple of jokes.
Fantastic. Honestly, look, I just love hearing about all this. I could listen all day, but I've got a couple of sort of more quick fire questions, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Who did you meet where you was most nervous?
Well, that's a good question. It's a really good question. I met George Best a couple of times. And I must admit, I was bowled over by him. I must admit, there's lots of footballers. I'm still in awe of footballers. I know that sounds a little bit sad, but I still think, wow, I want to be you. Even though you're younger than my son or whatever. Men in particular, I'm sure women to a lesser extent, but there's something about men who still, those men on the bus coming back from Goodison on Saturday were still singing about Peter Reid and Kevin Sheedy from 1985, you know what I mean? There is something about hero worship. So, yeah, most of them. Kenny Dalglish, first time I interviewed Kenny Dalglish. How about that? When I went to Radio City, he was like a god up there as a player, as a manager. And I remember I had to interview him. And he could be a difficult interview. Not rude or anything, but short answers and not really sometimes addressing the question that you'd asked. So yeah, that was one of the first times I sort of met a real superstar and thought, wow, you're Kenny Dalglish.
Amazing. And what's your favourite stadium to go to watch football or to work at?
Good question. I'm going to give you loads. Goodison, I absolutely adore. I love Anfield, the way they've developed it. So they've kept, I adored Highbury. I love White Hart Lane as well. And I'll also give you the Westfalenstadion in Dortmund, which is just awesome. I recommend anybody who wants to see some football on the continent that they go and see a Dortmund game. Just the scale of it, the noise of it. And one of the best games I ever saw there was a Champions League quarter-final against Malaga, and they were 2-1 down going into stoppage time. This was a quarter-final. and they scored 2 goals in stoppage time and got through to the semi-finals, where they absolutely blitzed Real Madrid and got to the final. And Jurgen Klopp was the manager then. And I did an interview with him afterwards, which one of the most enjoyable interviews I've ever done, because he was just beside himself with joy. So that stadium. Sorry, this is supposed to be quickfire, wasn't it?
No, that's fine. I love hearing it. I love
football grounds. I just love all football grounds, to be honest. Any ground I go to, there's just a magic attached to it. And even when you arrive early, we always get to grounds like 3 hours before kickoff, so they're empty, and you leave the ground empty. You see it build and everything. And I still have that sort of boyish enthusiasm that I had as a kid when you used to go to Highbury, get there an hour and a half before kickoff, stand on the terrace and watch the atmosphere build up. But if I was to pick one, can we have Highbury again?
You can always have
Highbury. We'll always have Highbury.
You probably answered, but favourite game you've ever seen? Would it be that Dortmund win? Or would it be something else that you've seen live?
I went to see the Cricket World Cup final, right?
Okay, wow.
At Lord's, and I came out of it. It was one of the greatest games of all time. My former boss, Barney Francis, I saw him outside, and he said, "Oh, that was the most amazing sporting event I've ever seen." And I went, "What about Arsenal winning at Liverpool?" And he said, "Everything comes back to Arsenal with you, doesn't it?" And so, unfortunately, we're going to be at Highbury again here for this anecdote, because this was both personal and I think historic as well. So the Invincibles, I was there for the final game where they got over the line, and we talk about the Invincibles.
Talking about
yeah.
Wow.
So it was Leicester City, final day of the season, and they're 1-0 down. They're 1-0 down, and you're thinking, oh my word, 38th game, it's all going to go. I need to choose my words here carefully. It's going to go Pete Tong. Obviously, Arsenal came back, they won 2-1. But then there was a presentation, and I was able to go on the pitch for the first time in my life and walk around with the players and do the interviews. So I interviewed Bergkamp, at the clock end, interviewed Thierry Henry, I interviewed Arsene Wenger. And it was just surreal for me because, as an Arsenal fan, I had a season ticket at the time, and I looked up at the top of the North Bank. I could see my brother sitting in my seat, and we waved. And
wow.
I was on the pitch, and I was surrounded by, and I was a fanboy. I hold my hands up, and that was the moment I thought, wow, this is why I'm doing this job. And it ain't going to get any better than this, I don't think. And it hasn't. And Arsenal still haven't won the league.
No, we just glazed over that, but I'll try and edit that bit out. And finally, have you got any signed shirts? And if so, what one's your favourite?
I've only got the one signed shirt. Actually, when I left Sky 18 months ago, and Dan Tolhurst, who's an absolute legend at Arsenal, sorted out a signed shirt for me as sort of a goodbye.
Wow.
And so he invited me back to a game. So I watched the game, which Arsenal watched. I watched it in the director's box alongside, Edu was in front of me. Gareth Southgate was there. But the best of all, Pat Rice was a couple of seats down. And the mate I went with is Irish. Mike absolutely adores Arsenal, but he's Irish through and through. So to see his joy at seeing Pat Rice and just shaking his hand was lovely. So Arsenal shirt, that's all I've got, to be honest. I haven't kept a lot of things. I kept the odd ticket stub from big games, cup finals. France 98, I've kept that. The Cricket World Cup final was just unbelievable. I've kept that. So bits and pieces. Signed shirts, no, I haven't. I should have got into that years ago, shouldn't I? Because it's quite a lucrative business now.
Oh, it's huge now, isn't it? I mean, don't get me wrong, I would never sell my shirts unless I was going bankrupt. That's the only time I'd sell these shirts behind me. But yeah. Honestly, Guy, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show. Guys, I hope you've really enjoyed listening. The insight's been phenomenal. I'm getting goosebumps talking about the Invincibles as well, which I'm sure we could talk about for hours and hours. But I hope you've enjoyed it. Hopefully we can get Guy back on the show.
I'd love to come back on.
We can talk more stories.
You can ban talk of Arsenal. No mention of the Gunners.
No. Well, I'll be honest, we're Arsenal fans, so we're always happy to talk about Arsenal. no matter what we do, it comes back to Arsenal at some point. So anyone listening going to go, oh, here we go again. They've done it again. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed listening, and we'll catch you soon. Thank you very much.
Cheers, Ben. Thanks.